almost the most critically acclaimed of all progressive rock albums at this point in time, possibly the most critically revered, the King Crimson album with the most credibility and respect and adoration, other than the first one. But among the true King Crimson devotees, this is the one. This is the masterpiece. This is the finest thing in their studio repertoire. I'm at the point in my life where I can't help but feel this way, absolutely. I mean, my praise for the first album was one thing, but my praise for Larks, Tongues, and Aspic is actually even greater. This is like Black Sabbath. If Black Sabbath weren't watching Hammer horror films and snorting a lot of cocaine, instead they received these visitations from like Mayan gods or something or other, and could play their instruments a lot better. But I'm not trying to dig Sabbath, but King Crimson's virtuosity here is pretty off the charts, especially in rock music at this time. There's absolutely nothing like it. And the presence of percussionist Jamie Meyer, one of the greatest guest contributions, the greatest guest contribution on a King Crimson record. And much like in The Court of the Crimson King, even more so than in The Court of the Crimson King perhaps, it's this album which it's both this vast experiential listening voyage, and yet it's also this piece of recorded music which I can pop on at any time if I want to decompress and relax. It's both of these things. It's a strange and unusual thing. Wild, at least 2 decades ahead of its time, this might be the greatest argument for the progressive rock movement of the early to mid-1970s we will ever hear. I don't think it falls into any of the cliches too much. I think the common complaints and criticisms of progressive rock, I don't think they necessarily apply here to an overwhelming degree. As far as I know. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you disagree. I don't think it gets that much better than this. Well, for myself, there's not many albums I've found that I enjoy more than Larks, Tongues, and Aspic. There are some, although it's like 7 or so, maybe at very most. Let's go for the track list and see how it holds up. Maybe it won't be as strong this time. You never know, right? Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 1, Book of Saturday, Exiles, Easy Money, The Talking Drum, Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 2. The only track that I have a slight complaint about, and it's barely a complaint, it's more of a nitpick. Exiles, it's not really a song so much as 3 different parts of a song that they've fused together into a track. And it's really good, and it's very impressive, and it's very sonically interesting at a base level, although I have to point that out, nevertheless. What I adore that song for is, in particular, I'll just mention this now, is it's one of the last vestiges of King Crimson having a kind of sailor or lighthouse sort of feel to it, which is long gone by not just Starless and Bible Black, but pretty much side B of this album. Obviously, the title track, Part 1, is what it is. Book of Saturday is my favourite, short King Crimson ditty, little acoustic number. I think Book of Saturday is phenomenally beautiful. It actually kind of warms my soul a little bit. And for a prog band to do an acoustic song like this, it's like, Rush have Closest to the Heart. No one pretends that's... Well, people do... I don't like that song, personally. I'd say I'm a Rush fan, and I don't like that song, which is kind of odd, but it is what it is. The Book of Saturday is beautiful. It's like one of these gorgeous short this is King Crimson, Pink Floyd numbers. It's actually quite pretty. Exiles, I said my piece on. Easy Money, King Crimson doing just casually the best and most interesting basic 70s hard rock song of all time. In 73, Pink Floyd releases Money. In 73, King Crimson releases Easy Money. Well, I wonder who did it better. I happen to think that this is I prefer this album to Dark Side of the Moon if I had to choose. I tend to think of preferring King Crimson to Pink Floyd in general. Although I think just because King Crimson's on my mind, but I meant to say Pink Floyd has a more consistent discography, I might say. In terms of each album is what each album means and to me versus what each King Crimson album means to me. Although I prefer the sound of King Crimson. It's an odd thing. It's kind of odd, The Talking Drum is absolutely stellar. It sounds like a precursor to both Bruford's 5G and what I've always suspected that was a precursor to, again, bringing it back to Rush on YYZ. And then Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 2 concludes what might be the finest rock album of the 1970s to my ears, in terms of it being a rocker album. The Taking Tiger Mountain's kind of, prancy sort of frilly art rock, whereas the there's a real, Larks, Tongues and Aspic rocks. It's the best album of the 70s to rock, as far as I'm concerned, for my body. If heavy metal spawned from 20th century classical music rather than blues rock, Black Sabbath, it might have sounded like King Crimson on Larks, Tongues and Aspic. Credit must be given here to a violinist slash keyboardist David Cross, one of the most talented people to ever work in King Crimson, apparently, because his contributions to this album are godly. I can't. This is all these unique sounds come together to compose essentially, my favorite King Crimson record. I listen to some of the music on this album and I think, I like them. This is not a diss at them, but if anything, it's a compliment to them, but a backhanded one perhaps. But could Dream Theater even play some of this music? I don't know how much of it King Crimson tried to play live a lot of the time. Or at least it's so precise, and obviously, if you're a drummer trying to replicate Bill Bruford and, getting used to not relying on your snare might be a bit challenging to some, obviously. Wetton's bass parts are very tricky, and Fripp is another story. I know guitarists, I'm not a guitarist, but guitarists I know tend to be quite frightened of trying to play like Fripp. I'll never forget, actually, I'll just share this anecdote because it's a little bit fun. I had a co-worker once. I used to work in a warehouse where I was warehouse picker for about a year there. Dental products, actually. Fun times, somewhat. I had a co-worker there who was he was an electric guitarist. He loved it. He was into, very, very technical sort of player, and he liked all the stuff we can imagine, but he also had a soft spot, acknowledged the tastelessness of the Steve Vai and Joe Satriani thing, but he still really liked it anyway, and he really liked to play that way. And I asked him, what are your thoughts on, like, Robert Fripp, for example? And he said, I don't really know Robert Fripp and King Crimson like that. Well, the music, I know of them. And I said, well, hey, I know he expressed a lot of love for some of those great Peter Gabriel songs that come on the radio. Games Without Frontiers and what have you, Salisbury Hill. So I said, why don't you listen to this track called White Shadow off of Peter Gabriel's second album, a brilliant album, obviously, and listen to Robert Fripp's guitar solo with me. And even just on my little Android phone speakers, the moment that solo started, he was entranced. He moves his face in closer to the phone speakers, and he starts, like, miming it along, like, vaguely, like, moving his fingers as though on an invisible fretboard or, guitar neck, and just, like, imagining how he might play, how Fripp's skating those sounds. And he's utterly euphoric. He's going, oh my god, that's so tasteful. Oh, that's so tasteful. Oh. It was just magnificent hearing, a guitarist, just a casual guitarist, or, like an electric guitarist you'd never heard of, never really spent much time with Robert Fripp, having that experience, and that was a very memorable moment in my life. Larks, Tongues and Aspic is rock music for Cthulhu. I don't think there's a King Crimson album with as much variety, brazen creativity as this one. Feel free to offer other nominations in the comments. I know some prefer Red. Some nominate Red as the fine. I absolutely love Red, one of my favorite albums of all time. A lot of people prefer Red because it's very focused in comparison to a lot of the variety / versatility on this album. I tend to prefer the variety to the more focused album. No disrespect to the more focused albums or the people who prefer a more focused album, but I'm more of a Houses of the Holy than a Zeppelin 4 or Zeppelin 2, for example. I outlined the variety on Houses of the Holy is part of the reason that's my favorite of their discography, because I like that there's a wide, varied experience, and this is subjective to some degree, but I think Zeppelin nailed all the genres that they tried on Houses of the Holy. And Larks, Tongues and Aspic, it's a wide sweep for a variety of sounds, and it's certainly the most varied King Crimson album from this point onward. We could talk about the first album potentially in the wake of Poseidon, though it is consistently quite jazzy. Islands is almost it's fairly fine stab at what we now call post-rock, but I don't even know if I'd go that far. That might be a bit audacious. Lizard's kind of your jazzy, early prog, I wouldn't call it fusion. Quite heavy, though, for what it is. Medieval and fantasy prog-ish. Very Peter Sinfield, of that time. So now I'm thinking maybe there's no King Crimson album with as much interest and variety as Larks, Tongues and Aspic. Again, feel free to comment if you disagree. I'd love to know. I really would like to, actually. An album that never fails to improve my day. And at the end of everything, isn't that the best thing that an album can be? I also feel like it's the King Crimson album to play for those who have a certain opposition to progressive rock, or feel as though progressive rock was kind of a bad idea. They might still have valid reasons for thinking it's a bad idea. I may have been a bit much in my Tales from Topographic Oceans video by Yes in decrying the naysayers of progressive rock. I'm a Mark Fisher acolyte. I can only have so much disdain for those who held their own disdain for progressive rock of the 1970s, especially those who were more adjacent to it, obviously, in the UK itself. But I would love to be with them when they listen to Larks, Tongues and Aspic and hear their thoughts on it. Surely this was as valid an argument for progressive rock as ever was. The coolest and most interesting King Crimson album in the discography. Possibly the most cool and interesting of 1970s progressive rock albums also. Can't get enough of it. Have nothing but nice things to say here. Please comment if you disagree. Or if you agree, that's awesome as well, obviously. I'm sorry this review isn't as interesting as it probably could or ought to be, although I don't know what I can say here that hasn't already been said. I revere this damned thing, and it makes me sound like an absolute fool.